At exactly 0837 local time, 42 miles south of Kangaroo, two Danish F-16 fighting Falcons achieved something that hadn't happened in 75 years of NATO history. They locked weapons on a United States Air Force transport aircraft carrying 134 American soldiers. No warning shots fired. No diplomatic channel consulted, just two allies staring at each other through targeting computers while Greenland's constitutional crisis hung in a balance between them. Inside the lead F-16, Captain Lars Hendrik Persson watched the green diamond bracket to settle around the massive American cargo jet. His AIM-9X Sidewinder had achieved infrared lock. The warhead was armed. His finger rested on the weapon's release. The American pilots aboard the C-17 Globemaster believed they had authorization from Nuke's provisional government to land. The Danes believed they were intercepting an invasion of Danish sovereign territory. Someone was about to make a decision that would shatter the Atlantic Alliance, and both sides would be using American-made equipment to do it. The F-16 Fighting Falcon wasn't supposed to be pointing weapons at American aircraft. Denmark had purchased 77 of them starting in 1980 as part of a joint NATO procurement built under license at Sapker in Belgium, paid for with alliance funds designed specifically for collective defense against the Warsaw Pact. The Royal Danish Air Force had flown them for 4 decades. Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, always alongside Americans, never against them. The aircraft Persson was flying that morning had been upgraded to the F-16AM MLU standard in the late 1990s. Midlife update, new computers, Link 16 data link, A application G66 radar with increased range, the ability to carry AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles and precision-guided munitions, a fully capable multi-role fighter that can hold its own against anything short of 5th-generation stealth aircraft. Denmark had recently begun selling off these jets. 24 to Argentina, 19 transferred to Ukraine. The ones remaining were being phased out in favor of F-35 Lightning IIs. But for now, the F-16AM remained Denmark's primary air defense asset in Greenland. And on this morning, that meant intercepting an American transport that Copenhagen viewed as a violation of Danish airspace. The bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The F-16s were American-designed. The Sidewinder missiles hanging from their wingtip rails were American-built. The training Persson had received came from American instructors, and now all of it was aimed at an American crew flying an American aircraft under what they believed were legitimate orders. Technology doesn't care about alliances. It only cares about physics and targeting solutions. The C-17 Globemaster III wasn't built for dogfighting. 4 Pratt ton Whitney F-117 turbo and engines generating 40,440 pounds of thrust each, a wingspan of 169 feet, a maximum takeoff weight of 585,000 pounds. The thing was designed to hold main battle tanks into forward operating bases, not evade heat-seeking missiles traveling at Mach 2.5. Inside the cockpit, Major Sarah Chen and her co-pilots had exactly 3 defensive options: flays, chaff, and prayer. The AN application AAR-47 missile warning system would detect the launch. The A application AL-47 countermeasure dispenser could pump out decoys. But against an AIM-9X with its focal plane array seeker and advanced infrared countermeasures, those defenses were optimistic at best. The missile could pull 60 G-tons. It featured thrust vectoring control that let it maneuver like a fighter jet shrunk down to missile size, and it carried a 9.36 kilograms blast fragmentation warhead specifically designed to shred aircraft. The C-17 wasn't armored. It wasn't particularly maneuverable at low altitude with a full load. It was a flying aluminum warehouse that would turn into scattered debris if that Sidewinder found its mark. Advanced when the Soviet Union still existed versus a weapon system designed to defeat 5th-generation threats like trying to win a knife fight when your opponent brought a laser-guided sword. But here's the thing about allies caught in constitutional crisis. They don't calculate threats the way adversaries do. A regime defending sovereignty against what it views as annexation sees moral imperative where rational analysis sees catastrophe. Desperation follows its own terrible logic. Denmark hadn't deployed F-16s to Greenland to intimidate. They deployed them because the alternative was watching their Arctic territory slip into American control without resistance. The 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement had given the United States the right to operate military bases with Danish consent. Now Washington was dealing directly with Greenland's provisional government, bypassing Copenhagen entirely. Denmark faced a choice: acquiesce and lose Greenland or enforce sovereignty and risk shooting down NATO allies. Neither option was acceptable. Both were unavoidable. Tanganga Luswak sits 300 kilometers north of Greenland's capital Nuuk. Population fewer than 500 permanent residents. But the airport tells a different story. Built in 1941 as Bluey West 8, an Arctic airfield carved out of Arctic tundra to support transatlantic ferry routes. Renamed Sundstrom Air Base in 1951, home to thousands of American personnel during the Cold War. The launch point for resupply missions to D-line radar stations scattered across the ice sheet. When the Soviet threat receded, America closed the base in 1992. The Danes took over, turned it into Greenland's primary civilian airport, but the runways remained. 3,000 m of Cold War concrete capable of handling anything from turboprops to strategic transports. And in January 2026, Denmark had begun upgrading it. Hardened shelters for F-35 fighters, fuel storage for extended deployments, command facilities for Joint Arctic Command. The message was clear. Denmark intended to defend its Arctic territory with more than diplomatic protests. The F-16 station that were proof of concept, a visible demonstration that Copenhagen could enforce sovereignty if pushed. What nobody had calculated was how fast theory would become reality. The C-17 Globemaster III had departed through Air Base 90 minutes ago. Official mission: transport 134 Army Rangers to participate in joint exercises with Greenlandic security forces. Actual mission: establish American military presence at Kangaroo to demonstrate support for Greenland's independence movement. The Rangers carried enough equipment to set up a forward operating base, communications gear, defensive weapons, enough supplies for 30 days. Washington's calculation was simple. If Greenland declared independence, American forces needed to be positioned to support the new government immediately before Denmark could object, before NATO could intervene, before the constitutional crisis became a military crisis. They were 12 minutes too late. The constitutional crisis had already become a military crisis the moment Denmark scrambled fighters at 0841. The Danish flight lead transmitted on guard frequency: American transport. You are entering restricted Danish airspace without authorization. Alter course immediately or you will be engaged. Major Chen's response was equally direct. Danish aircraft. We have clearance from Greenlandic authorities to land at Kangerlussuaq. We are operating under provisions of the 1951 Defense Agreement. The legal argument was debatable. The tactical situation was not. 2 F-16s with weapons locked versus 1 unarmed transport. Physics didn't care about jurisdiction. The Sidewinder seek attract heat signatures from the C-17's 4 turbo and engines, each one burning jet fuel at thousands of degrees, creating an infrared beacon visible for miles. The AIM-9X vocal plane array seeker painted the entire aircraft in thermal gradients. Hot engines, warm fuselage from air friction, cool wing tips were metal-met Arctic air. The missile's computer had already calculated intercept geometry, lead angle, closure rate, optimal detonation point to maximize fragmentation pattern against the target's profile. All it needed was permission to launch. One squeeze of Peterson's trigger. Inside the C-17's cargo bay, 134 Rangers sat strapped into canvas seats facing inward. They had no windows, no visibility, no situational awareness beyond what the pilots chose to share over the intercom. Most didn't know 2 Danish fighters were pacing them at 3,000 feet, tracking them, preparing to fire. They were passengers on a diplomatic crisis with wings. Their fate entirely depended on decisions being made in cockpits and capitals they couldn't see. The loadmaster knew he'd been monitoring the radio, heard the intercept warnings, watched the pilot's body languid shift from routine to tense. But what could he do? Order everyone to brace for impact? Explain that their flight home might end as scattered wreckage across Greenland ice. There was no ejection option for cargo aircraft, no parachute for passengers. If the Sidewinder found its mark, everyone aboard had maybe 2 seconds between warhead detonation and structural failure. Not enough time to process what was happening. Barely enough time to register the flash. Like being inside a can when someone fires a shotgun at it from outside, except the can is flying at 260 knots and the shotgun fires tungsten fragments at supersonic velocity. 0845. Washington finally responded to Copenhagen's furious diplomatic cables. Orders transmitted through NORAD to Thule Air Base to the C-17 crew. Abort landing at Kangaroo, return to Thule immediately. Major Chen acknowledged began a gentle banking turn to the northwest, away from Kangaroo, away from the Danish fighters, away from the constitutional crisis that had nearly killed 137 people. But the damage was done. For 4 minutes, 2 NATO allies had been seconds away from fratricide. For minutes where the Atlantic Alliance hung on the decision-making of one Danish fighter pilot with his finger on a weapons release. For minutes that proved alliances aren't physics. They're agreements. An agreement can shatter faster than aluminum under blast fragmentation. Captain Peterson watched the American transport turn away. Watched the range open. Watched the IR lock break as the C-17's heat signature faded below his seeker's threshold. His wingman called the engagement terminated. Both F-16s climbed patrol altitude and resumed their combat air patrol pattern. The Americans departed Danish airspace. The crisis de-escalated. Nobody died, but everyone involved understood what had almost happened. The unthinkable had been one trigger squeeze away from reality. The cost analysis was surreal. Denmark expended approximately $60,000 in jet fuel and maintenance to intercept one American transport. They revealed their F-16 deployment patterns, demonstrated response times, showed Washington exactly where their red lines were drawn. The United States expended $147,000 to transport rangers who never left their aircraft. They damaged alliance credibility, proved that sovereignty disputes trump NATO obligations, demonstrated that even close allies will point weapons at each other when territorial integrity is questioned. Total expenditure just over $200,000. Return on investment, the realization that 75 years of NATO unity can evaporate in 8 minutes of constitutional crisis. Expensive tuition for a lesson that should have been obvious. When you bypass a sovereign government to deal directly with their territory, don't act surprised when they enforce their borders. Could have learned it from a history book. Would have been cheaper. The fundamental calculus of alliance warfare is trust, not firepower, not technology, not shared values. Trust that your partner won't aim their weapons at you. Trust that legal disagreements get resolved through diplomacy, not computer targeting. Trust that NATO Article 5 means collective defense, not selective application. That trust fractured somewhere over Greenland at 0841 when a Danish pilot achieved weapons lock on an American crew when both sides realized their alliance was conditional. When everyone understood that sovereignty disputes can override alliance obligations in under 10 minutes. The C-17 landed back at Thule. The Rangers never saw Kangerlussuaq. The F-16 returned to their hardened shelters, but the message was delivered louder than any diplomatic cable. Denmark would defend its territory, even against allies, even using American-made weapons, even knowing it might destroy NATO in the process. Like playing chicken with your best friend while both driving cars made by the same manufacturer. Technically possible, strategically insane. Definitely proves nobody's bluffing. The broader implications rippled outward for weeks. Every NATO ally with territorial disputes suddenly understood the new rules. Alliance obligations apply until they conflict with sovereignty, at which point weapons trump treaties. Russia watched from the Arctic. China watched from Beijing. Both understood that NATO's unity was negotiable. Both calculated how to exploit the fracture. And both knew that Greenland just demonstrated the alliance's breaking point. All it took was 8 minutes of constitutional crisis and 2 F-16s willing to enforce their government's position. The alliance that had stood against Soviet expansion for 75 years nearly tore itself apart over an Arctic island neither side could afford to lose. The real lesson wasn't about Greenland. It was about what happens when alliances meet sovereignty, when technology meets politics, when missiles designed for collective defense get aimed at collective allies. You discover that alliance unity is theoretical until someone calls your bluff. Then it becomes physics, and physics doesn't care about 75 years of shared history. It only cares about thrust vectoring, infrared seekers, and blast fragmentation patterns.